right, welcome back to another episode of Questions with Crocker with me, Dr. Crocker, the emergency veterinarian, and Shane.
The not veterinarian.
Do you want to be like, Shane, the entrepreneur?
I really don't want any kind of introduction. Just let me randomly talk periodically.
I have to let people know who you are. I can't just have some random guy's voice on it and not have people know who you are.
Be like a mystery.
My mystery co-host.
Yeah.
Shane Crocker, you are my husband. You can't deny the fact. You're an entrepreneur. We own a vet hospital together. And I'm an emergency veterinarian / speaker / social media personality. And so I'm excited to do this podcast with you today. We have a hot topic we're going to talk about. Lots of strong feelings about this topic. And so I think it's going to be a good one. I don't know if you have strong feelings about it, but I think from a business owner perspective, you might have some interesting thoughts. So we're going to get into it shortly. But first, I wanted to tell you about a case that I had at the ER the other day. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Do you like hearing about cases?
I don't dislike it.
Okay, so I had a big golden doodle come in the other day, and this was a really cute dog. She was really active. She was like 2 years old. She looked great on exam. She was licking everybody, really happy, but the owners were like, she's a chow hound. She always eats really, really well, and she hasn't eaten today. And she is a doodle, was known to get into stuff sometimes, and so I, was automatically worried that she might have eaten something, and they said when she went in the yard, she was also kind of straining to poop a little bit. So what are your thoughts and what would be your next steps you would do this case?
I would make the assumption it ate something. Probably do x-rays or ultrasound.
Yes. So great thought, imaging. And you definitely can do an ultrasound. Unless you're really, really good at ultrasound, you can't always find like a foreign object. You might see, intestines that are really enlarged and fluid filled, or a stomach that has a lot of stuff in it, which if they haven't been eating, obviously that's like big red flag, right? The stomach should be completely empty. So we decided to do x-rays because she wasn't eating and she was having a hard time pooping. So I didn't know if there's something going on with the front part of the intestines or the back part of the intestines. And we took one x-ray and could immediately see the problem. And she had something in kind of her colon rectum area. And so it was actually very satisfying. And I know this sounds weird, but I said, let me do a rectal and just see if I can like reach it and grab it. Because the other option would be we would hospitalize on fluids, give her time. And usually with fluids, like it gets kind of the intestines moving, and she probably would have been able to like poop it out, or we would have been able to get it out eventually. But I wanted to see if maybe I could get it out without her being hospitalized. And so I did a rectal, and it was actually kind of funny because we're in an open concept ER. So like everyone kind of gathers around when you're doing things that, might show something cool or interesting. That was really good hands. So our dog tried to murder our light. We're okay now. Everything's okay. Quick hands. Good job. All right. This is our life. So anyways, dog had something stuck in her, and I did a rectal, and I could like just the tips of my fingers like feel something, and I was like, I'm going to get this. And so I like kept working at it, and I was able to grab it and like slowly pull a sock out. And it was like a couple inches long, and everyone was like videoing it and talking about it. And as soon as I did it, we're all like, yes! And it was great. And the owners were very happy. And the dog was like, whew, okay, feel better. And they went home and they sent us a message and said she ate great after that, and she was pooping normally and everything. So it was kind of fun because usually in the ER, what you have to deal with is never like that simple.
So if somebody said, hey, tell me why you're not a veterinarian, I would refer them back to that story.
You wouldn't be standing around cheering, watching me like pull something out.
No, we'd pull anything out of its butt.
You have to. That's our job.
That's why I'm not a veterinarian.
We have to. We're saving lives. We're saving lives one colonic foreign body at a time in the pet ER. All right, that's okay. You stick to finance and HR, and I will stick to foreign bodies and dogs. Is that a deal?
Deal.
All right. So what we're talking about today has nothing to do with foreign bodies in dogs, nothing to do with anything medical or surgical in patients, but it does have a lot to do with things going on in veterinary medicine. And this is actually a really hot topic right now. So what we're going to talk about is non-competes. And I had Ava on TikTok who wanted to know what my thoughts were. And she didn't really say if she was pro or con non-compete. So why don't you explain to everybody what a non-compete is? And then I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
So I think anybody that is going to work for a company or any company that's hiring an individual never anticipates that person wanting to leave. Most of the time you're wanting to work for a place because it's a great fit and you're hiring somebody because it's a good fit. A non-compete allows the business owner to protect against that person deciding to leave and bringing customers with them.
True. And in veterinary medicine, it usually involves like a certain specific radius that you can't work in if you leave for a specific amount of time.
Yeah. So again, I know we say this all the time. We're not experts here.
No.
Most of the time, you would have an attorney draw up the contract. Typically, it's inside of an employment agreement, and there's some non-compete language baked inside of there. It's very state dependent on what's legal and not legal, what can be enforced, what can't be enforced. A lot of times, you have to have a monetary dollar amount attached to that. So let's say you give somebody a signing bonus of X. A lot of times, a percentage of that signing bonus will be attached to specifically the non-compete clause. So now you have a defined territory, a defined amount of time, and monetary compensation for that.
So if you break your non-compete, you have to pay them a certain amount?
Well, typically you can't break the non-compete or you will be sued.
So that is some of the fine points of it that we will have to get into on whether or not it's even enforceable and do people actually get sued. So a couple of things that I'll say about veterinary medicine specifically. It is very dependent on where you live, and the radius is very different depending on what you do. So if you work in a general practice, I often see kind of smaller radiuses, especially in like suburban or city areas, because there's so many vet hospitals close by, and they basically don't want you to set up right down the street, right? But the radius is a little bit smaller versus maybe a more rural area where there's less competition in a zone. Or if you are a specialist in veterinary medicine, some of these specialists have like state almost non-competes where you can't work in this state as a specialist if you leave our practice. And it can be really difficult for people who have spent a really long time becoming a specialist to work and leave a company if they no longer want to be there. And so I do think that there are both sides of the table that feel very passionately, either they're pro or they're con. And I think instead of us just saying like what we think, it would be good to kind of work through why someone might be for a non-compete and why someone might be against it. The other thing I would like to define is non-competes versus non-solicits, because I think that that is a differentiation that not everyone understands also. So let's start with the pros. So why, as a business owner, would you want to enforce a non-compete?
I think just, again, it's protecting your revenue. So if you have a very good veterinarian that comes in and for whatever reason that person decides to leave, and maybe they spent 10 years with you and they built up a clientele or a book of business, the last thing you want them to do is go down the road, set up shop, and start bringing all those patients to them. I would hope that, well, I guess I'm on the opposite side of why you want to put a non-compete in place. You need to make sure that that veterinarian is taken care of so that they have no intention of leaving, right? That's a whole different conversation. But from a business owner perspective, it would be very difficult, A, to lose that doctor to begin with, but then lose the doctor and lose the patients or the revenue is pretty difficult.
Yes. Replacing a veterinarian these days is almost impossible. And then the amount of time and resources you put into training somebody and then building a clientele, like that's not something you can just hire somebody else back into that position. It takes, again, a lot of money and time to get back to the point that you were at with a veterinarian who was there for a while. So I can see where, as a practice owner, I am, devastated if they leave, both emotionally and financially, and they set up close by and people are going to them. Now, in our situation with our veterinarians, I don't love the idea of a non-compete, but I can see the value of it. And I think the other thing is, even if you're pro, it's not always enforceable or easy to enforce depending on what state you're in. You do actually have to sue somebody. So you have to put money and time into a lawyer and suing somebody. And I mainly see it being enforced with larger corporations. I don't see it as much with private practitioners, because who has the time and money to try to sue like their past associate? It just doesn't really happen. So a lot of people say, like, I don't care about non-competes because they're not really enforceable. And you don't hear about people getting in trouble from them unless you work for a really large corporation that has the means and the funds and the lawyers to come after you. So I do think that's something to look at. And the people who are most pro non-compete are more those larger companies that really need their vets to stay and maybe don't have the relationship, between the people making the decisions and stating they need a non-compete with the people who are actually in the hospitals working. And so it's a very separate thing, but they're like, we have to keep these vets. Everyone's short-staffed. It's hard to hire. And so they have those in place. Now, not every company has that. I work for Veterinary Emergency Group. We do not have that. And so I don't want to make blanket statements about private practices versus corporations, but I don't see it being enforced as much in a private practice setting, which doesn't mean you shouldn't respect it. So I did have a non-compete with my last practice within a certain radius, and the hospital that we own is outside of that radius. I also have a non-solicit. So can you explain the difference between a non-compete and
typically non-solicit can mean two things. One, you can't go back and solicit other workers that you worked with, technicians, other veterinarians. Also, non-solicit can mean you can't go after old clients as well. So no calling them and saying, hey, I moved practices, come see me instead.
Right. And I do think most of them are going to have a time term on them. Mm-hmm. So I think mine was, I left the practice and I couldn't hire anybody from the practice for 2 years. And it didn't matter where I set up shop, right? I just couldn't hire anybody. And also I couldn't solicit clients. Now, I do think the soliciting clients thing is interesting because with the invention of social media and just how much our lives are out there, any of my past clients can find where I am. And so I don't have to solicit clients. And there have been some clients that have found out I owned a hospital and, have moved their records over and are coming to see me. I did not solicit those people. I just have it out there in the world that, hey, this is where, my hospital is now. This is when I'm there. And they've chosen to come there. So I do think it's kind of a gray area a little bit, right? What is solicitation?
Yeah, I think it's meant to be. I'm not going to walk out the door with the customer list that I printed out and going to turn on an email or call those guys and say, hey, look, I'm moving. I mean, that's the intent of it, which, again, I don't know how many people actually do that. It may happen in other big business where you have a sales guy that's got a book of business. Maybe he does that when he leaves. But veterinarians, for the most part, aren't going to, go solicit old
clients.
Patients. Yeah.
I agree. I think the taking team members is the bigger deal.
Yeah.
And I could see that as a practice owner, building a good, strong team is hard. And if you have a veterinarian leave and some of your technician team or receptionist, that can really hurt a practice really quickly. Now, let's talk a little bit about why you wouldn't be for non-competes and what is the con of a non-compete.
I mean, again, I think it's a tool that we use to help hire, right? I mean, if you're not locking a veterinarian into a certain area, that's a bonus for hiring. So as an example, we want to hire somebody that really wants to live in Keller, Texas, and we tell them they can't work in Keller, Texas if they leave your practice, there's a good chance they're not going to come work for you.
Right.
Now, you can narrow that scope and say, look, within 5 miles of my hospital, you can't go to work for me. Right. They're probably going to be okay with that because there's plenty of other places they could work and still live in Keller. So I think some of it's dependent on how well defined that territory is, but you can use it as a hiring tool to get veterinarians to come on board, knowing that if this doesn't work out for whatever reason, I don't have to pick up my family and move to, North Carolina or something.
Right, because some people can't move. Like some people have, a partner who works locally. Some people have, kids that are in a certain school that they really feel like they need, or their support system is here and they need to be close to family or close to certain people. So, the people that say it's not fair to have a non-compete are looking at that and saying we don't want to affect people's lives like that. I am in the camp of I don't want anybody to stay at my hospital because they're scared. Yeah. I want a team that wants to be there, wants to work, enjoys working together, enjoys what we're doing, enjoys our culture. And if I'm locking them in, basically chaining them to my hospital with a non-compete, they're not happy.
Yeah.
Right. And so if they're not happy, they're not going to show up and do a good job. They're not going to take good care of the pet patients. And so I don't like it in that regard. And I think if you do have one, having a very reasonable one based off of where people live and what they want to do and what might happen life stage wise, why they would have to change, I think is just a conversation you have to have.
Yeah. And again, the intent of the contract is to protect against things that may happen in the future that nobody really expects, right? Again, the intent when you come in is this person's going to work here till they die. I'm going to be so happy with this employee that we'll never want to get rid of them. That's the intent. But if something were to happen and they don't want to be there, I'm with you. You don't want them there. Go find another job. But protect yourself a little bit so that they're not going to turn around and set up shop right across the street from you, right? Make them go a little bit further away. And if the clients follow, the clients follow.
Right.
They probably weren't your clients anyways. So you're probably going to lose some clients no matter what, but at least set up some type of parameters where you're not completely, blocked in and can't continue your business.
I am more pro non-solicit than I am pro non-compete because I can see where the non-solicit would really hurt you a lot more. But I think yes, for hiring, when I say we don't have a non-compete, I think that makes a difference. The interesting thing is you keep saying your thought process is you hire people and they stay on forever. I think that's changed. That used to be the case. It used to be you would, become part of a job and you'd be there a long time. I heard something the other day that the next generation, it's 2 years that they're staying in a job and then they're changing. And so I think we have to shift a little bit our mindset of, people are very loyal and going to stay at the same place and that it's going to serve them for a long time. And it may be that you love somewhere. I've done this. I've had a lot of jobs I've loved. It's changed what I want long term, and what I want long term doesn't fit where I am anymore. So jobs that I've left, I haven't left on bad terms. I'm still friends with all my past bosses. I've respected any parameters they put in place that kind of protected their business. But I was very open and honest about what I wanted and what I needed. And when I left, they understood why I was leaving. But I do think the idea of you're going to hire people and that's going to be your team for a long time is changing. And so you have to adapt and change with that as a practice owner, or else you're going to miss out on some really great employees. And even though it really sucks to lose somebody and retrain somebody, I would rather have a rock star employee for 2, 3 to 5 years than have a okay employee that's going to be there 15 years. I would rather get people in there I really enjoy and are great. And sometimes those people are going to be hustlers. They're going to keep growing and they're going to outgrow what I can offer them at the practice. Maybe they want to own their own practice. That's great, right? So I don't want to have the mindset as an owner.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And so here's the caveat to it. You don't want that rock star setting up shop across the street from you.
True.
It's great that they were great for 2 years and helped you build your business and were great employees and great person to work for. And you want them to succeed. You want them to go do whatever they want to do, just not across the street from you. That's what the non-compete's protecting against.
That's a good point.
Now, I will say, if you're an associate being presented with your employment agreement and there's a salary or some type of agreement in place, and then there's a sign-on bonus, and then there's non-compete language, negotiate that non-compete language. Mm-hmm. Narrow it down to something you're comfortable with, but then also say, hey, look, if I'm going to give you this non-compete, you need to also pay me for that.
Right.
So they've already established what a bonus up front is. Get an addition to that that's specific for that non-compete language.
The other thing I would say is it can be expensive to fight a non-compete if your boss does come after you after the fact. But I also am aware that there are some companies that if you leave and the non-compete is seen as unfair, there's some companies or people that are hiring you that will actually help you fight it. So you can stay local or you can change. And many of them have been very successful because essentially my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert, but my understanding with a non-compete is if you can show it would be a burden, like for you not to stay where you are or you to move, and you can show that you're not going to directly compete, like there's something that would make it different, like it doesn't hold up.
Yeah, again, we're not experts in that. And some of it's going to be dependent on how tight the language is.
And
right?
the state.
Yeah, if it's very state dependent. But if you decide that you're going to write your own non-compete language and have an associate sign it, there's a good chance that's not going to be very tight.
Get out of it.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, if it's written by a good attorney that knows, HR language in the state of Texas, as an example, it's probably going to be enforceable if you really want to enforce it. Right. Now, the question, like you said, it comes down to, do you want to really spend the time and energy and the money to fight it? Probably not.
Probably not.
Now, if the guy, again, or associate is sitting up across the street from you and their intent is to solicit your best technicians and to go after 50% of your business, then yeah, you may have to fight it. Right. But if they're just not happy and they have a conversation with you that, hey, I'm going, staying in Keller, but I'm going to work over here, and my intent's not to take technicians. My intent's not to go after customers. You're not going to fight that. I mean, you're just going to let them go and
right. And you're
go
going
hire
to wish them
another.
well.
Yeah.
But I think this, ultimately speaks to the core of like, what do you want your culture to be for your hospital and your practice? And also, what are the conversations you're having with people when you're hiring? I'm about being very transparent and being very open. And even if somebody said to me, I eventually want to own a practice, but I want to work with you, I want to learn how to run a practice, I want to grow my skill set, I'm still okay with that because, again, teaching and training and working with somebody who is great and will help better the profession and making them a better practice owner in the future, I still see as a win. But it's having that open and honest dialogue along the way and making sure you're both on the same page and you're okay with it. I think the problem becomes when you have employers say, this is what you have to do to work here. And you're like, yeah, I'd be so happy with that. But deep down, you're like, I'm only going to be here this long and this is my plan and it's not going to be long term. And then eventually that comes to a head. So as a practice owner, I want to be overly communicative about what I expect and like where I see that person fitting in and how long I see them fitting in. And I would hope that they would do the same. But I definitely don't want to lock somebody in with a non-compete and make them feel like they have to work here versus want to. I think that's ultimately why I'm not as pro non-compete versus other people.
Yeah. And as a business owner, I think, again, protecting yourself is one thing, but creating a culture and an environment and a financial model for your associate veterinarians where they're more incentivized to stay because of how great of a place it is to work and how well they're financially compensated for what they do makes more sense than trying to fight a non-compete because they just really want to leave.
Right. It's like being in a relationship. You want them to want to be with you and want to spend time with you, communicate what they need, fill their needs, right? Versus like they're scared to leave. Like that's just not a healthy relationship and you're not going to get the best out of them and you're not going to have the best team if that's what you do. So ultimately, I'm not a fan of non-competes. I can see why certain people are pro and I can see where they could have a place if they're done correctly and both parties are comfortable with it. But I do think the next generation, there's actually people that put on their LinkedIn, don't reach out to me if you have a non-compete in your contract.
See, I've got a problem with that too, though.
Oh,
like,
okay.
Why? Is their intent to steal all your customers and set up shop right down the street?
No, it's because they feel like the people that would reach out to them that would have it wouldn't be the sort of culture and company that they want to be a part of.
Again, I think that's lack of conversation. So if I'm sitting across the table from you and say, hey, look, I think you're a great vet. I can't wait to build a great business with you. I look forward to seeing what this happens in the future. Maybe you'll be an owner at some point in the future. Maybe if you want to go open up your own practice in the future, we'll support that. Here's what I have to do. to protect myself, I've got to create a parameter where you can't go work 5 miles from me. Are you okay with that? 2 miles from me. Are you okay with that? Right? Have that conversation with them. And there's no reason not to set up parameters that both people can be happy with.
Right. But ultimately the question becomes, if they say, absolutely not, I won't sign it for whatever reason.
And that's probably not a good person to work with anyways.
Right. Like they need to find somebody who's on the same page with them about it. I honestly don't mind them putting it out there, right? Because to me, like if there's someone that feels that strongly about it, and as a practice owner, I'm like, I need something in place to be comfortable with this. Even if we have a good relationship, then you know it's not a good fit. So I'm okay with them putting it out there. I just think it's funny because I do think it's a little bit of like a badge of honor of people saying like, I don't want this. And I think it is a little bit of a marketing tool, which we need that nowadays. Everyone's trying to hire. And if you're going to use that to help hire, that's totally fine too. But I do think I can see the pros and cons of it. And making it too restrictive or making it where people are scared is not it. So ultimately, not a big fan, but I understand the other side of the argument.
Again, I think some professions have much more of a need for non-competes, especially, again, if you're a high-profile sales associate. There's probably a need for non-compete.
Because you have the relationships.
Because you have relationships.
100%.
Veterinarians, for the most part, they have relationship with customers, clients, but it also depends on the type of practice you have set up, right? If you have it set up where each patient has their own doctor and that's all they see, that's one thing. If you have patients that just call in and get an appointment, and whatever doctor they see is the doctor they see, that relationship is a lot less important, right? So the need for that non-compete is probably a lot less. And again, I'm not saying you have it so tight where they can't leave at all. Just squish it down a little bit where they can't set up shop right around you. And you also may find that, depending on what city you live in, they may not be able to set up shop right around you. So it may not even matter, right? Or maybe there's not even another veterinarian that's close to you that they can go work for, right? So it may not even matter. So don't dig your foot in the sand over a non-compete if it's really not relevant. If there's nowhere they go work close by anyways, and they probably can't go get the permits pulled to set up their own place next to you, then don't worry about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think don't make it such a issue where you can't ever hire somebody great, right? And I do think it is something that being open and honest and just having a conversation about is important. But I also think being like so extreme one way or the other doesn't really serve us well. And I think it's interesting the conversations that are had around it. And I'm interested to see what people think about our thoughts.
And again, if I'm an associate going in and I feel like this is a great place to work and they're going to pay me really well and it's the perfect schedule for me and they want to non-compete, but it's a 5-mile radius. I mean, why not sign that, right? I mean, don't be so stuck in your way that you have a non-compete. If that non-compete is, not super restrictive, then don't worry about it.
And it does make a difference whether you're going in general practice, specialty,
Agreed.
You have less options with the type of practice that you're going into.
100%.
So you have to look at it really closely. So I think the whole thing is there's not one right answer for it because there's so much variety in veterinary medicine and there's a variety in people and what their intentions are and what they need. But I think as a practice owner, you have to figure out what type of culture you want to promote. And you have to understand that if you want to hire, especially the younger generation of veterinarians, it could absolutely be a sticking point and something you need to decide, like how important is this to you or is it not? And for me, it would not be enough of an issue that I wouldn't hire somebody who I really feel strongly would be a great team member.
Yeah, and if I'm an associate, I'm just using that as a
negotiating
tool. I mean, use that like, hey, I'm willing to give you this, but what are you going to give me in return, right?
I think that's a great point. And you can make things work for you. And I don't think that listening to what someone else says works for them means that you have to do the same thing.
That's a good point. I think too many people say, so-and-so did this, that's what I'm going to do. That may not be a good fit for you or this specific. You may have a time where you sign a non-compete because it makes sense. And then you may have a time where you don't sign a non-compete because it doesn't make sense. So I think it depends, like you said, it's very specific on where you're at in life and the type of practice you're at and what state you're in and what your limitations are for moving, not moving, if you're a specialist. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that conversation.
Well, it's a hot button topic, and they're actually trying to make it illegal to have non-competes. That is a push in quite a few states. So it'll be interesting.
With that.
I figured you would say that. It'll be interesting to see what happens with it, and we'll keep you updated if there's any big things. And if you have strong opinions about non-competes, I would love to hear about it.
And if you've gotten burned by non-compete, I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, like if you have a horror story, or if you've signed 5 and it's never affected you in your career, I would love to know that too. I think we always hear like the really dramatic stories about it. We don't hear about all the people that have had a non-compete and it's never affected them in any way. So everything that is said and shared has to be taken with a grain of salt, in my opinion, especially with these hot button topics. So hopefully we kind of sort of answered the question on why you would or wouldn't want one, how you should set it up and have the conversation if you do decide to have a non-compete, and also just figuring out how important it is to you truly as an employee and as an employer. If you have other questions in the future, we like talking through these things. Again, we're not experts, but we have strong opinions in general. So you can send those to us at Questions with Crocker on any of the social media platforms. You can watch us on YouTube, or you can listen to us on Apple or Spotify. And we come up with the podcast weekly. Definitely need your questions to keep going, and we appreciate you listening. Have a great day. Thanks.